The system spread fast once Stavka camouflage inspectors saw the reconnaissance photographs that followed. Across the Don front and later in the build-up to the Stalingrad counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, entire dummy villages were constructed using Koren's method, disguising not single tanks, but full assembly areas, with painted barns hiding armor, painted haystacks hiding fuel and ammunition dumps, and painted wells disguising forward observation posts. Soviet records, many still incomplete or classified for decades after the war, suggest that disguised assembly areas in the Don Bend in late 1942 suffered measurably lower losses to air attack than comparable undisguised concentrations nearby, though exact comparative figures remain difficult to verify given the chaos of record-keeping during the period. What is documented is the German side's confusion, Luftwaffe reconnaissance logs recovered after the war, and interrogations of captured Luftflotte 4 personnel describe photo interpreters repeatedly flagging the same rural structures for review and repeatedly clearing them, because nothing in the photographic signature matched the profile of military deception their training had taught them to look for. No straight-edge netting, no telltale geometric regularity, no shadow anomaly. One interpreter's post-war account describes a sense of unease about a cluster of buildings near a river bend that he could never quite justify with evidence, a feeling he could not translate into a marked target because the photograph showed him exactly what a farm should show. Whether that single account represents one man's lucky instinct or a wider unease running through German reconnaissance units that autumn is impossible to say with confidence. The surviving documentation is fragmentary, and Soviet Maskirovka units themselves rarely recorded which specific deceptions caused which specific German hesitations, treating the uncertainty as simply part of how the work was done. Set against German efforts at the same kind of deception, the comparison is not close. The Wehrmacht did employ camouflage extensively, and German engineers built dummy tanks and dummy artillery positions of their own, particularly in the deception operations preceding Kursk in 1943. But German fake structures were built primarily to be seen and counted as a numbers deception, inflating apparent strength for Soviet reconnaissance, not to disappear entirely into the landscape the way Koren's barns did. German dummy positions were typically static, built once and left, lacking the maintained signs of daily habitation, the rotating laundry and the shifting smoke that gave Soviet disguised positions their persistence under repeated observation. A German dummy tank built from wood and canvas might fool a single photographic pass. It rarely survived a second look from a suspicious interpreter returning 3 days later to find nothing had changed. No footpath worn into the mud, no fresh cart tracks, no variation at all in a supposedly lived environment. Koren's units, by contrast, treated the deception as ongoing theater, rotating actual personnel through disguised positions, specifically to wear paths, light fires, and hang washing, because a held breath, sustained for months, only works if every detail keeps moving the way a real farm moves. Where the German approach asked, "Can this be photographed and mistaken for the wrong thing once?" the Soviet approach asked, "Can this survive somebody watching it for a season?" And that second question is immeasurably harder to answer, which is exactly why so few units anywhere in the war ever attempted it at this scale. The wider legacy of Koren's painted barns sits at an odd intersection of material, fact, and psychological warfare, and historians still argue over how to weigh the two. What is not disputed is that Maskirovka, the broader Soviet doctrine of operational deception, of which Koren's camouflage workshops were one expression, became one of the most consistently effective and chronically under-acknowledged Soviet military disciplines of the war, contributing to the near-total surprise achieved before Operation Uranus and again before Operation Bagration in 1944, when entire armies were hidden, moved, and concealed from German aerial reconnaissance that had every technical advantage and still failed to see what was coming. What is disputed is how much credit any single workshop or any single painter deserves within a doctrine that involved tens of thousands of engineers, decoy units, and radio deception specialists working in parallel across an entire front. Koren himself, by most surviving accounts, never sought credit, returning after the war to set design and scenic painting, apparently uninterested in discussing the years he had spent making tanks, looked like barns for an audience he was desperate never to please. No purpose-built museum exists for his specific unit's work, though examples of Soviet wartime Maskirovka equipment and photographs survive in the Central Armed Forces Museum in Moscow, fragments of a discipline that left almost no physical wreckage behind, because the entire point of the work was that it should never be found. Koren kneels in the mud again, months later, outside a different village whose name does not survive in the surviving unit log, and this time, the brush in his hand is nearly empty. The war has moved west. The tanks under his disguises have rolled forward without him, replaced by newer vehicles needing newer disguises. And the paint he mixes now is thinner, the brick dust harder to find, the curtains he paints onto steel windows a little less careful than they once were, because there is less time and there are fewer hands. He does not know, kneeling there, that men flying overhead in aircraft he cannot see have stopped circling back. He does not know that somewhere in a dark room in occupied territory, a photo interpreter is staring at a print of a building that unsettles him for reasons he cannot name and will mark, finally, as clear. Koren only knows the brush, the angle, the shadow that has to fall exactly where a real shadow would fall. A barn that was never a barn, a village that was never a village, a war that was, in places, fought and lost and won by men who never picked up a weapon at all, only a brush, and the patience to paint a lie so carefully that an empire's best eyes looked straight at it and saw nothing but home. To understand why a paintbrush became one of the most effective weapons on the Eastern Front, you have to understand what the Soviet Union had lost by the autumn of 1941. German aerial reconnaissance, flown by specialist units of the Luftwaffe's Aufklärungsgruppen, had become devastatingly good at reading a battlefield from altitude. Photographic intelligence sections at Luftwaffe headquarters could take a strip of aerial film and, within hours, mark every armor concentration, every supply column, every freshly dug gun pit on a map, accurate to within a few hundred meters. This was not guesswork. German photo interpreters had studied shadow length, tone contrast, and ground disturbance with an obsessiveness that bordered on the academic, and Soviet forces paid for that obsessiveness in burning steel. At Smolensk, at Kiev, in the vast encirclements of 1941, columns of Soviet armor massing for counterattack were located, photographed, and destroyed before a single shell left a Soviet gun barrel. Production figures tell part of the story. The Soviet Union lost over 20,000 tanks in 1941 alone. Many of them never fired in anger, caught instead in marshalling areas by Luftwaffe bombers directed onto targets identified hours earlier from the air. Camouflage netting helped a little. Dispersal helped a little more. But netting and dispersal could not hide the one thing that always gave a tank away from above: its shape. A flat plane of green canvas thrown over a turret still left a turret-shaped shadow at dawn and dusk, and shadow was exactly what German photo interpreters had been trained to read. Soviet camouflage officers understood this, and recommended scatter patterns and decoy positions, and still the losses continued, because a decoy that looked like an empty field looked exactly like an empty field with a tank parked in it. The problem was not concealment. The problem was that concealment, by its nature, drew the eye to the thing being concealed. Something else was needed, not hiding the tank, but replacing it in the eye of the man looking down, with something his training told him to ignore. By the spring of 1942, nobody in the Red Army's camouflage service had found that something. There was no solution. The man who found it was not a soldier. Pyotr Koren had spent the 1930s as a set painter and scenic designer for provincial theaters around Voronezh and Kursk, building plywood village squares and painted backdrops for productions of Gorky and Ostrovsky. And when the war came, he was conscripted not into infantry, but into the engineering camouflage service, a branch the Red Army called Maskirovka, a word with no clean English translation that means something closer to the art of deliberate deception than simple camouflage. Koren's unit operated out of a requisitioned collective farm building near Liski, a few dozen welders, carpenters, and 2 other former theater men, working with whatever sheet metal, lumber, and pigment they could scrounge from a country whose factories had every other priority. His obsession, colleagues later recalled, was angles, specifically the angle at which a German reconnaissance pilot's eye, or his camera lens, would actually meet a structure on the ground. Koren had spent years building stage scenery, designed to fool an audience sitting at a fixed distance and a fixed height, and he understood something the Army's camouflage manuals had missed. Deception is not about removing information. It is about supplying the wrong information convincingly. A tank under netting tells a trained eye something is hidden here. A tank that looks convincingly like a hayloft tells the same eye nothing at all worth noting. There was a night in June 1942 when Koren's first full-scale mock structure collapsed during testing. A timber frame meant to sit over a KV, one heavy tank buckled under its own weight in a rainstorm, and the canvas roof, soaked through, slumped to reveal the turret beneath it just as a liaison officer arrived to inspect the work. Koren did not panic. He reportedly stood in the rain study the collapsed frame for nearly an hour before sketching the fix on the back of a ration chit. Lighter wooden trusses braced like a theater flat rather than a real roof, designed to bear only their own weight, not to withstand weather because a structure could be rebuilt overnight and a tank could not. The system that emerged from Koren's workshop was deceptively simple in concept and painstaking in execution. A frame of light timber, roughly 2.5 meters at its tallest point, no more than 80 kilograms, 175 pounds, of lumber and nails, was built to slot directly over a tank's hull and turret like an oversized hat, resting on the vehicle's tracks and fenders rather than the ground, so it could be lifted clear in under 3 minutes if the crew needed to fight. Over this frame went canvas, scrap roofing tin, and in some units actual salvage barn boards, shaped into the unmistakable silhouette of a peasant outbuilding. A sloped roof, a suggestion of a hayloft door, sometimes a section of fake thatch made from twisted straw, wired to a mesh backing. Koren's real genius, though, was in what happened next, the part that separated his work from a child's pasteboard fort. He painted shadow. Using the crushed brick and lamp-black pigments his team mixed by hand, Koren painted false shadow lines beneath the eaves and along the base of each structure, mimicking exactly the soft-edge shadow a real building would cast, at the sun angle most likely during reconnaissance hours, late morning, when Luftwaffe sorties over that sector typically flew. He painted false weathering, streaks of gray beneath, where a real roof would have shed rainwater for a decade, and false texture into the canvas walls, so that from 3,000 meters through a camera lens, the material did not read as flat fabric, but as something with the broken, imperfect surface of old timber. Crews were trained to maintain the deception even at rest, hanging real laundry from the false eaves, letting real smoke from a cooking fire drift past the structure, so that infrared and visual observers alike saw the unmistakable signs of habitation. The first full test came outside Voronezh in August 1942, 6 T-34s, disguised as a farm cluster, sitting directly beneath a known Luftwaffe reconnaissance corridor, and when the aircraft passed without altering course, without circling back for a second photographic run, the watching camouflage officers did not cheer. Koren later told a colleague that the silence afterward was the loudest sound he had ever not heard. If you have stayed with this story this far, a subscription costs nothing and means you never miss the next piece of history like it.